Well, good morning, everyone. It's 10:30, so we'll make a start on this, the next in the series of seminars on resilience, which are being hosted by Scottish Forestry and the Institute of Chartered Foresters. Welcome along today. The focus of today's seminar is very much on tree health, and as a subset of that, we're really looking at bark beetle resilience. While we're talking about this, and we've got some great speakers, while that's going ahead, please think of it though in the round for a whole of tree health. Consider how you're managing your forests, how we should be managing forests for the holistic view. But there are some great lessons we can learn as we go through. For those of you who don't know me, apologies, I haven't got a video on. We're having minor computer problems this morning. Luckily, all our speakers were all working fine, so that's okay. And probably to your advantage, you won't be able to actually see me, just hear me. I'm James Knott, the head of the tree health team in Scotland. And as part of my team's remit up here, we look at what could be the future problems from a tree health perspective. What are the future risks and what can we do to mitigate them? And that's done across the UK with all the devolved administrations, and we all work together. And most of you will be aware of the Plant Health Risk Register that's produced and is hosted on the DEFRA UK government website. And that's part of looking at the future risk. What could be the impacts of different pests and diseases within the plant world, and particularly from my point of view, within the tree world. Now, just give you a slight sort of feeling looking at resilience. There are really three aspects when you look at a plant and a disease and getting an outbreak. And to get an outbreak, you need a suitable pest or disease, which is going to be virulent. You need a suitable host, and you need a suitable environment. And if you put all of those three together, you have a very high chance of getting a big outbreak. So when we're looking at resilience, we're trying to see how can we break that triangle. Which one of those can we remove from the equation or minimize to reduce the impact that we're likely to see? We'll look at it, and looking at the history, and we're very lucky that Iptifographus isn't actually a new problem. It's well researched, it's been well seen, the impacts have been well documented, particularly in Central Europe. So there's an awful lot we can learn and see from that. So what can we pick up? What can we learn to make us better placed for the future? And that's what I would like you all to think about as we go through this. And I suppose we are incredibly lucky that we have a very experienced and incredibly knowledgeable panel with us today of speakers. If you want to see their full biographies, please have a look online and have a look at the landing page for this event, and you'll be able to read all about them. But in brief, we're going to start off with Professor Thomas Lasny and Dr. Marcus Lindner. Now, Thomas, he's made a significant contribution to the understanding of really the causes and the impacts of recent bark beetle outbreaks across Europe. And he's also worked very hard at developing innovative management and policy frameworks as how we can actually address such issues in the future. And here we're doing the first part of the presentation alongside Marcus. And Marcus has, well, over 30 years now of experience in research on climate change and the impacts, and particularly the development of response strategies in forest management. So we've got a wealth of knowledge there that we can actually try and learn from and see from their experience. They will then hand over to Dr. Max Blake, who a lot of you will probably already know. Max is the UK scientific lead on eradicating Iptifographus. And I suppose his research really focuses on improving the holistic surveillance techniques for invasive bark beetles and improving the predictions of when and where these invasive species will become problematic. Once the three of them are finished, we will collate and talk for questions. And that's an opportunity for us to actually discuss different issues. And I'll join them then in case there's any particular questions from a Scottish policy perspective. but I expect the questions really to be for the three of them. And we're lucky that from my team, we have Dr. Flora McDonald, who's going to actually collate the questions as we go through. So please put them in the chat as we're going. And Flora will do her best to try and collate them into some form of order for us. And she will either ask you if you want to ask your question direct, or if there's a group of questions, she may ask on your behalf. And we'll try and keep us on time and focused as we go through these questions. I suppose the last thing to say is that the presentations will be made available afterwards. And if we don't get time to answer all your questions in the timeline we've got today, we will try and collate them and get some responses published for you afterwards, if that's okay. So with that, I think that's quite enough from me. And I'm going to hand over to Thomas and Marcus, who will start us off.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, James. Can you all hear me well?
Yes, yes.
Excellent. So I will share my screen. Can you see the screen in presentation mode now?
It's not in presentation mode at the moment. We can see your other slides now. That's it. That's in presentation mode.
Okay, excellent. So thank you very much, James, for introduction. Dear ladies, gentlemen, it's really my great pleasure to be here with you today and perhaps share some of our experience. Bark beetles and notably Ips typographus has been causing troubles to foresters for centuries, particularly in countries which focused on Norway spruce. However, in the past, most of these outbreaks were somehow within the scope of forestry capacities and within the capacities of timber industry, and even the big outbreaks could have been somehow absorbed and the activities could continue uninterrupted. This situation has changed after 2018, when the scale of damage has become unprecedented across Europe, and it quite exceeded human, logistic, and wood processing capacities, and it even impacted international timber markets. A strong evidence suggests that there is an association of this recent outbreak wave with climate change, and as we are at the early stages of foreseen climate change, the future risks can be really high. And I know that foresters in the UK are well aware of these risks, and recent appearance of Ips typographus in Kent caused quite an upheaval, which is indeed well justified. Before we delve into bark beetle population dynamics, impacts, and management actions, I would like to give the floor to Marcus to guide you through recent trends in disturbances and climate in Europe. Marcus, can you take over, please, now?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks a lot for inviting us. And I'm also very happy to be here with you to give a bit of background on recent trends and disturbances. And this graph shows one of the types of evidence we have about disturbances in Europe. The other one is remote sensing data. We also have very good remote sensing trends about disturbance impacts. But this is ground-based data about disturbances which have been collected since 1950. This data set goes until 2019. But you can see that there's a lot of up and down with some individual big events, but also an overall increasing trend. Next, please. And when you look at the different causes of disturbances, you see that actually all these different causes, the most important one was wind, then fire, bark beetles, they all show increasing trends. But particularly the biotic risks have increased a lot, and most expressively the Ips typographus development. And we've had simultaneous outbreaks now in several countries across Europe. Next, please. So the most important disturbance agent overall over this time period is the wind damage, and you see that it's a very stochastic effect of very large singular storms that have caused the most damage overall. But besides these big events, there's a lot of smaller disturbances caused by wind, which are then very often triggering also the bark beetle outbreaks afterwards. Next one. So bark beetle outbreaks have been around, as Thomas said, for centuries, but you can really see that there was an enormous increase of the damage from bark beetles in Europe. So again, this is data from all of Europe combined. And if you would add here 2020 and 21 and 22, you would even have a larger spike, this very drastic increase of bark beetle damages over the last few years. And this has now reached a level that, as we will hear later, damages regionally can even exceed the total plant harvest volumes. Next. And behind this is the climate change. Climate warming has been, of course, manifesting itself since the mid-1980s, much more than before. And you have all seen many different graphs where we see the uncertainty about future climate. I just want to remind that the current warming rate that you see on the left is very quickly exceeding this window of 1.5 to 2 degrees warming that we, as a world society, have agreed with the political commitments to not exceed. The emission reductions will need to be much more severe very, very quickly. But it's also important to remind us that besides this trend, we are currently approaching this 1.5 degree of global warming, but we already have evidence that there's different rates of warming on land. And you see on the right that the global warming over the land areas has been much higher than over the sea areas. And while we have now almost 1.5 degrees of global warming at the global mean average level, we've already experienced warming over the land areas, especially in Central Europe, which is sometimes exceeding 3 degrees already now. Next, please. And the evidence about climate change has, of course, been getting more solid over time. And you all have certainly heard about the IPCC reports. The last one was published 2023. And what is shown in this rather messy slide here is that particularly the risks have increased very much in the recent assessment report. There's much more extreme weather events documented. The distribution of impacts is much more severe in the last assessment report compared to earlier ones, which all this explains that we have had a kind of a system change in our climate patterns, and what was forecasted earlier didn't actually fully capture what we have experienced in the last few years. Next slide. And one example of this is the heat wave that we have experienced in Central Europe since 2018. And on this graph, I just show you an example from a weather observation station in Potsdam, Eastern Germany, which has been measuring temperature and other meteorological variables since 1893. And you see in the past, there has been always ups and downs in average temperature over the growing season, which is what is shown on this graph. And there were some extremely warm years, which may be 1 or 2 degrees warmer than the average. That was the first few decades of observations. But due to the change in the weather circulation patterns over all of Europe, particularly influenced by the warming in the Arctic, the extreme events are getting more persistent, more droughts, but also more floods. And what this graph really shows very drastically is that the temperature anomalies have been really much more drastic in the years since 2018 compared to earlier. So you see this spike 2018. It was not it was a very exceptionally warm year, but it was not on this level of maybe 2 degrees warmer than the average in the first decades of the observation period. It was more than 4 degrees warmer, so doubling the extremes in just 1 year. Next, please. And you see this every year now that we are crashing temperature records. And this is a graph I just show with the 2022 record highs because there's this very dark area over UK, and you see that UK has been particularly affected by the increases in temperatures and setting new records that were not really existing before. Next one. And this is also backed by other evidence that the heat extremes, like the warmest days and the maximums of the warmest days, has really drastically increased since 1950, much more than the average warming. And even in Central Europe, the warming of these hot extremes is more than 50% of the average warming in the same period in the summer. Next, please. And in parallel to that, we have not only the increase in temperatures, but of course, this also then translates into drought conditions. And what we normally experience is that we have winter months with lots of precipitation. I mean, you guys in UK, you get more precipitation on average than we get in Central Europe. But this graph here is a image showing the average drought conditions over 200 inventory plots in Bavaria in the southeast of Germany. And usually you would have, like in the winter months, you would not have drought conditions in the soil, but you would have what was last year observed in 2017-18. You would have actually water above the zero line. But then from 2018 onwards, what you can see here is 3 years of continuous drought. And this kind of multi-year drought never occurred before the observed heat wave in 2018-2020 in Central Europe. And what we see from projections for the future, that hot summer weather might become longer lasting and having the risk of more persistent heat extremes in the future for most of Europe. Next. And with this, I conclude with my little excursion on the backgrounds on disturbance and climate effects. And you will now hear from Tomasz how this has been affecting the bark beetle outbreaks in Central Europe.
Thank you, Markus, for this very, very useful background. Now, in the next few slides, I would like to make you a tour, a certain overview of environments where outbreaks are happening, and also to give you some feeling and vision about the scale of these impacts. The important point is that these outbreaks have been occurring in all types of environments, from lowlands to high mountains, in intensively managed forests, in the same way as in strictly protected areas, and they were spanning from Central to Northern Europe. Nevertheless, it still applies that some environments are riskier than the others. You may have known that Czechia has become Europe's epicenter of recent bark beetle outbreaks. Here you can see one of these disturbed areas which was treated by heavy salvage logging. Therefore, all dead trees were removed, and you may see the emerging forest regeneration. What is astonishing here is the scale of outbreaks, and some of these disturbed areas are spanning over hundreds of hectares. The largest one we identify had 1,500 hectares. This is indeed a challenge, also from the view of restoration of these areas. This is other perspective from other region from year 2020. We still can see some standing dead trees. These previous slides were from relatively lowland environments and most fertile and productive areas in Czechia, but we see the same development also in higher elevation and even in mountains where climate is maybe a bit more favorable to spruce, and species diversity, tree species diversity is also a bit higher. This is the case from High Tatra Mountains in Slovakia from year 2004. This is outbreak that followed a wind throw in 2024. And we can see here that dead trees and outbreaks is locally reaching even up to a tree line. Recently, we have seen something like this also in European Alps, which have even higher elevations, and outbreaks are really expanding high. This is the case from Slovakia 2023, where we again experienced a huge outbreak initiated by drought, meaning not by wind as it is typically happening, but by drought. And in this slide, this is mountainous hilly, it's mountainous environment, and it is one of the most productive spruce zones in Slovakia. And you can see that the outbreaks are being managed by really heavy salvage logging with heavy machinery, which is basically causing in some locations quite an environmental devastation. This severe removal of dead trees is increasing the flood risk to the villages in the surrounding. It's causing the erosion, and you need to also expect that these huge clearings will be exposed to heat and drought, and even to really high pressure from game population, from ungulates, which really generates quite a reforestation and restoration challenge here. A very specific case is from the Czech Republic, where in 2022, outbreak area affected by the outbreak was subsequently affected by a huge wildfire, basically the biggest in our history. It is a national park at Czech-German border. I also must say that this fire was ignited by some crazy person. It wasn't a self-ignition, but anyway, this is also a type of new dynamics we are facing now. And just for the end, this is the typical Central European spruce forest, intensively focused on timber production. It has low static stability. Trees has very short crowns, and therefore they are not they do not have very strong resistance. Trees are very close to each other, and therefore they are competing for resources, and we have really huge areas covered by such unstable and high-risk forests, which we probably will lose in the future. This is the other perspective. So now let's take a look at outbreak mechanisms. How is it happening, and why is it all going on? So first, spruce bark beetle, we also call it an eruptive pest or eruptive insect. This means that bark beetle is transiting between two phases, between endemic phase and between epidemic phase, and he is simply moving here and there in time. In endemic phase, we have very low beetle populations. They are in very low numbers, and they are in these low numbers. They are unable to kill healthy trees. Therefore, they are flying through the forest over relatively long distances, and they are trying to allocate some damaged, broken, or dying trees, which has compromised its defense, and they are able to colonize it and breed on it. And this phase is characterized by quite scattered distribution of mortality spots like single trees or small patches. All the time, beetles are waiting for an opportunity to transit to epidemic phase, and this is typically a wind throw or a severe drought. And these events are providing huge amounts of breeding substrate. Beetles colonize this substrate, increase their numbers, and the main defining feature of transiting to epidemic phase is the ability of beetles to kill also healthy trees. These healthy trees are more nutritious, and they can provide more offspring production. And this causes like exponential increase in population densities. Here, beetles are so many that they do not need to search for weakened trees here and there. They can simply kill the nearest healthy tree and simply overcome it by numbers. Therefore, in this phase, we see more the expansion of mortality spots than the scattered appearance of new ones. And after a few years, for different reasons, these outbreaks tend to fade, or we also call it the population collapse, and beetle populations are transiting back to the endemic phase. I will speak later about the reasons of this transition. And basically, when it comes to management, our objective is to keep beetles in the endemic phase and do not allow them to cross we call it epidemic threshold, to cross it and unfold epidemics. And we are also trying to shorten the culmination phase and make beetles to transfer back to endemic phase. Here you can see that endemic phase is typical with the scattered distribution of single trees here and there. And in the epidemic phase, beetles can really roll across the landscapes. The main point is that the epidemic phase is characterized by the ability of beetles to kill healthy trees. All this dynamics is governed by different mechanisms. We are generally differentiating between inciting factors and predisposing factors. Inciting factors, as I said, are typically wind throws and extreme droughts. These are the events, short-term events, which are driving population growth. Predisposing factors, there can be really many, and they are somehow defining how high is the epidemic threshold, how difficult it is for beetles to unfold epidemics. So the most important ones are low tree species, high diversity and high concentration of mature spruce trees, high tree age. More mature, older trees are more vulnerable than younger. High stem density and high competition between trees for resources. And specifically the large plantations of spruce outside its native range. So here I would say that long-term spruce-oriented management is basically the major predisposing factor of current outbreaks which we are experiencing now. And then we have here another factors operating at shorter time scale, like heat and drought stress, emergence of forest edges after the harvest. As soon as you make a harvest, you may expose tree stems to the sun. These stems are becoming irradiated. Trees are getting to the conditions of stress, and they are attracting beetles. So historically, we have been always experiencing bark beetle outbreaks, which were some large-scale outbreaks which have been initiated by wind throws. These new dynamics, which is associated where outbreaks can be triggered by severe drought, are relatively new, at least at such a scale as we are observing them now. So traditionally, there was always a wind throw needed, which provided this breeding material. Beetles colonized these trees and built their populations. And the beetles used to stay within these wind-felt areas for 1 or 2 seasons, depending on weather, until the wood was fresh. Then, after this period, the enlarged population of beetles left the wind-felt area and expands to the surrounding and colonizes a healthy tree in the surrounding. The point is that at this phase, beetle population is already large enough to kill healthy trees. And of course, management strives to quickly remove all these big wind-felt areas to prevent this from happening. We can see, for example, here, this is wind throw from High Tatra Mountains in Slovakia from 2024, which affected a belt along circa 50 kilometers along the mountain crest. And after this, if I remember well, 2-year period, the beetles left the wind-felt area and moved to the slopes in the surrounding and caused the damage which was perhaps comparable to the damage caused by the initial wind throw. This is the area of national park. It is non-intervention zone, and therefore you may see these dead trees standing here. Outbreak termination. As I said, outbreaks have their cycles as beetles are transiting here and there between epidemic and endemic phase. And it's interesting that while we understand relatively well factors triggering or initiating the outbreak, we do not really understand so well factors that lead to outbreak collapse. It's a kind of combination of exhaustion of local resources. There can be certain buildup of natural enemies of bark beetles. Bark beetles have their fungal symbionts, so also these fungal symbionts, they are very essential for successful outbreak. So there can be some changes in these fungal communities. There can be some effects of management. But for example, here in this graph, you can see 3 concurrent outbreaks in 3 different countries, and they followed basically the same pattern, and conditions and managements were different there. So there is still something what we do not fully understand. Effects of climate change. Markus already said in his presentation that this recent outbreak dynamics is strongly associated with climate change. And there are several processes how climate change affects bark beetle development and outbreak dynamics. So first, bark beetle development is strongly driven by temperature. So temperature increases can accelerate beetles development. And at the same time, tree defense against bark beetles very strongly depends on the availability of water. So if we have more dry season, if we have higher evapotranspiration, if we have less water, trees are unable to defend themselves against bark beetles. To look at it in closer detail, climate warming or increase in temperature extends the flight season. Beetles are allowed to fly earlier, for example, in the spring. It increases the number of new generations. We know that bark beetles can produce some number of generations per year, and this development is driven by temperature, air temperature, and subsequently bark temperature. As I said, it compromised tree defense due to climatic stress. Bark beetles and their outbreaks may expand to regions like in high elevations or high latitudes where we weren't experiencing the outbreaks previously. Very important effect of climate change is the synchrony of outbreaks over large geographical areas. As we have seen it, it can even be across Europe. The point is that while wind throws were acting as sporadic isolated events, and outbreak was always constrained to the area around the wind throw, these huge heat and drought spells can affect the huge geographical areas and synchronize the development of outbreaks across many countries. All together, under climate change, we are expecting that bark beetle outbreaks will be more frequent and that they will be more severe. When it comes to bark beetle to this synchrony of outbreaks, we can see here that until 2016-17, this pattern in individual countries is quite random. But after 2017, this increase happened across countries like Czechia, Northern Italy, Germany, Sweden, and others. I just collected the data only from those few now. And this is quite a challenge, for example, for management, for the availability of transportation and storage capacities, but also for timber markets, which are expected to absorb these huge amounts of salvaged woods coming synchronously from many outbreak areas. And to the future, we are expected to see such synchronous events more and more. When it comes to generation time, there are different models how we can assess, depending on temperature data, the number of generations which can appear per year. This is already one study where also Max Blake, our next speaker, participated in, and he will probably say more, that you already have such model developed also for UK, where for example, F1 and F2 means first filial generation and second filial generation, and SB sister brood, but I will leave this to Max. Just to illustrate for you how this change in the generation regime can look like. This is the Czech Republic, and this is the generation regime under past conditions from period 1960 to 1990. And the green is one generation regime. It is high elevation. Brown is two generation regime, and the red is three generation regime. So this is a past climate. If we move to the mid of the century, 2050 circa, we can see that two generation regime quite expanded. And by the end of the century, one generation regime basically doesn't exist any longer, and the whole country is dominated by 2 to 3 generation regime. So next, another important impact of climate change, effect of climate change, is the overall transition from wind-initiated outbreaks to drought-initiated outbreaks. The point is that the frequency of windstorms remains relatively stable to the future, depending on region, but there is no clear trend. On the other hand, the trend in climate aridification is much more severe, and this makes us to transit to this new type of dynamics. As I said, Czech Republic has become Europe's epicenter when it comes to bark beetle outbreaks. So just a few numbers for you. Here we can see that historically our regime was dominated by wind throws, and in this past period we really were dominated by bark beetles. So just a few numbers. During these 6 years, we have experienced the loss of 100 millions of cubic meters of wood. We lost circa 20% of spruce growing stock, and still circa 350 millions is remaining in the forest in quite vulnerable conditions. The outbreak was distributed across the country in such a way, and this central C4 zone had a size of 9,000 square kilometers, and it experienced the loss of 40% of forest cover. When it comes to reasons of this outbreak, this is the drought index, something similar as Marcus already shown, and the rectangle is our outbreak period. And you can see that the outbreak corresponds with the lowest index values and the extended period of these lowest values. What is striking is that this outbreak happened under the degree of warming circa 1.3 degrees of Celsius, and within the next 20-30 years, we are expecting 1 centigrade more, and till the end of the century, we are expecting maybe 4 to 5 centigrades more, which can make these future outbreaks really beyond imagination. Some distinct features of this outbreak in 2018, contrary to previous experience, beetles attacked younger trees than 50 years, which is something what is in each student book, that this is the threshold. Now we have even seen outbreaks Did something happen with my sharing?
Yes, you're not sharing anymore. You have to share again.
Okay. Is it good now?
Yeah, it's back.
Yeah, okay, sorry. So we even locally see the infestation of trees other than Norway spruce, mainly pines and larch. And while wind-driven outbreaks typically culminated within several years, that they have a bit extended culmination period, all these outbreaks across Czechia culminated within single year, as you can see it in these graphs, and then the outbreak quickly retreated. We still do not know if this is a general defining characteristics of these drought-driven outbreaks, or if this is just the specific case which we have observed now. During these outbreaks, we learned a lot. We found that we definitively do not have any workforce for managing such type of outbreak. We do not have storage and transportation capacities. In 2020, we experienced a timber price drop, which was again, foresters weren't motivated to do any salvaging under such price conditions. We weren't able to produce sufficient number of seedlings to regenerate, to restore the disturbed areas, and we were facing really high pressure from game. Basically, what we have planted, it was eaten by ungulates like roe deers and deers and cicadeers. And basically, it all collided also with the COVID crisis, which again limited the workforce availability and other issues. Concerning the responses from state and state owners, what we have done. So first measure was to reduce planned harvest, to make free the capacities for this emergency situation, and also ease the impact on the market. We make some modification in legislation to ease hiring of foreign workers, mainly from Ukraine. We compensated forest owners for this temporary decreased timber price to somehow make them in operation. We had some exceptions on the use of insecticides and so on. We developed a countrywide zonation, and different legislation rules applied in different zones, which was very important step when dealing with these limited capacities. We, for example, allowed transfer of reproductive material across seed zones, and we subsidize forest replanting by tree species other than spruce. This was already the awareness that we simply cannot proceed to the future with spruce-oriented forestry because their risks are too high. Therefore, these measures on changing species composition were quite supported and subsidized. And now I would go back to Markus.
Yes, so quite devastating pictures we've seen from Czech Republic. In Germany, you know, we also have experienced quite extensive bark beetle damages. In the region where I'm living, our office is located in Bonn, North Rhine-Westphalia. We've also had 145,000 hectares of spruce stands which were killed. And we have a big project called Superb Upscaling Forest Restoration, is the slogan there, where we demonstrate how we can restore these damaged sites after the bark beetle outbreak. And on the right, you see one of the districts in Wipperfürth, North Rhine-Westphalia, and you see here that there's quite sparse vegetation on the site. But the point is that we really have huge differences across different sites. And on the left, you see another of the 7 enterprises where we demonstrate the forest restoration measures, which is at the same time already fully overgrown with ground vegetation, bramble, and so on. And it's a much bigger challenge to actually introduce other species than spruce. So on the right side, you see what comes naturally very often is just like spruce regeneration. And then if you wouldn't do anything, then this forest would quickly develop back into a spruce forest, which you want to avoid to repeat the bark beetle outbreaks. So then in the region, they have developed guidelines how to actually then select the species for restoration. I will show some guidance on that a little bit later. But please just look at these 2 different contrasting sites. These are 2 examples that we see what happens on sites when there was just a monoculture of spruce, like we saw also in the Czech Republic. Next slide, please. But there were also other sites affected by the bark beetle outbreak, and this is an example of a pro-silver enterprise only 100 kilometers south of the areas I showed before. And in this enterprise, the same happened. There was a spruce forest, and they have lost hundreds of hectares of spruce forest across the whole enterprise. I think there's no single spruce trees. Well, there's a few, but hardly any spruce trees above 40 years are still living there. But what you see here is a very different situation. You see that there's a lot of regeneration already that was, it was already initiated before the bark beetle outbreak. And you have now a resilient forest where you can see that within years, this will be a forest again. Of course, the other sites will also develop back into a forest, but it might take actually some decades before the thicket of bramble will be actually replaced by some trees in some sites. Next, please. So what did this enterprise do differently? You see here an interesting example where you have on the right and on the left, you see actually the areas where there was already some trees before the outbreak. They were already established as advanced regeneration under the previous canopy. Next, please. The difference here is that this enterprise before, please, go back, please. So before the bark beetle outbreak hit this area, this enterprise had already opened up the canopies slightly to introduce like regeneration underneath the main canopy and to introduce more species because they were aware that this spruce forest was not a resilient forest. So when the bark beetle calamity hit the area, the trees died, yes, but there was no bare ground, but there was actually a very well prepared natural regeneration already waiting for the next cycle of forest growth here. In the middle of this picture, you see actually an open track, a former skidding track. And this is actually kept open for hunting purposes. So the main difference here is that this enterprise has intensified hunting. They're using different intensity of hunting, driven hunts, and they have resulted in a much lower game population. So 6 to maybe 12, 14 species can regenerate naturally on each of these stands here without any problems. So that's the main difference. There was advanced regeneration already established, and there was now measures that the game is not eating up your mixed forest that you would like to have for the future. Next, please. So we really try to mitigate disturbance risk, and we have to change our management to create more resilient forest systems. And we are investigating this. Me and Thomas, we are both working in this Resonate project where we are developing resilient measures to enhance resilience in European forests. That's the Resonate project. And then we have this other project, Superb, where we are developing tools to improve the forest restoration measures. And that's then the next slides I'm showing. We are creating information tools. Please, next. In North Rhine-Westphalia, they have already established guidelines and recommendations. They have on the left, that's a silviculture concept where they propose which species would be fitting to what areas in the region. And on the right, they actually developed very detailed recommendations on how to restore these damaged areas. So forest restoration concept is the literal translation here. Next, please. And what you can see is that they have introduced these tools into a digital information system. It's this NRW info, Waldinfo NRW. It's a digital tool where owners can go in, look at the maps, identify their forest area. Please, next. So they can select, they can draw a area on the map, and then they can, please, next. They can then select what kind of future climate scenario they're expecting, or what kind of species selection they want to take, considering more modest or a more high-end climate scenario. Next. And then they get actually recommendations for each of these areas, what kind of forest types are suitable under the changing climate to be restored here on these areas. And behind these numbers, there are always combinations of species, which are often mixture of natural regeneration plus planted species. But the general principle is that they are recommending that we should have at least 4 species in the future mixed stands here. Next, please. And then what is then also coming here are concrete suggestions on how to implement such forest development types. That's what WET stands for. And you see that there's not mixtures across the whole area, like single species mixtures, but they are rather planting groups of trees in different locations in the sites. That makes it much easier to maintain the species mixture in the future, and also enables to account for local site differences in the soil to target certain species to certain microhabitats which are more suitable for them. Next, please. So this has been then done for our enterprise in the superb forest restoration, and then we are using the project money to demonstrate how such a mixture of site-adapted species can be established here. And then we are actually inviting other forest owners and other stakeholders to visit these sites to see like how successful restoration can work. Next, please. So now we are coming back to the recommendations, and we will now take turns, Thomas and me.
Okay, thank you, Markus. And in the last section of our presentation, we formulated a few recommendations that could perhaps help you to reduce or control the future risks. So first, I would say be informed and be prepared. And I think this is exactly what Max Blake is currently working on. It's really very useful to have established trap-based monitoring system that can help you catch the first appearances, but also continuously monitor the changes in population levels and how they are responding to climate. It's very wise to have developed risk plans for all forested areas, depending where risks are determined based on stand, site, and climatic conditions. And we may pay specific attention to riskiest areas which are at a high risk, and we may decide, for example, for the reconstruction to other forest types that can manifest a lower level of risk. What's very, very important, and we found it really essential in Central Europe, is the communication with forest owners and making them aware about the risks associated with climate change, and specifically risk associated to spruce-oriented forestry and forestry-oriented on monocultures, that this is simply not a sustainable way for the future. Markus, now it is...
So in the past, the response was always really a response to a disturbance. There was very little proactive management to actually foresee what will come. And what we have learned from all these experiences with managing not only bark beetle outbreaks, but also storm damages and so on, is to really understand that it's a disturbance risk management cycle we need to develop, where response, recovery, prevention, and preparedness really go hand in hand. So we do have some options to reduce the risks of future disturbance outbreaks through silvicultural operations. And we can also constrain outbreak risk and reduce the impacts and facilitate recovery with the right response measures. So I guess, yes, that's the sense of this slide. And then
Thank you. Maybe I would add here one experience or note that in Central Europe or in continental Europe in general, we somehow overestimated the options for controlling direct control of bark beetles through sanitation, logging, insecticides, and trapping using devices or trap trees. And we simply believed that we can go on with these spruce monocultures to the future, and we can control these risks through these active measures. But it seems that now we have a problem. We simply haven't used efficiently these last 30 years for adapting the forests and creating resilient climate-adapted forests. And now maybe the message for you is that you still in Scotland may have this time ahead of you, which you may use for adapting forests to future. And this simply means to follow just basic climate change adaptation rules about diversification and site suitability, and this can make the forests fit or resistant not only to bark beetles, but basically any threat or risk that may appear in the future. And we somehow tried in our effort to transfer this knowledge to policymakers and managers, we tried to organize all these recommendations in a so-called outbreak management toolbox, which is organized in these 4 phases of risk management cycle, which Markus already mentioned. And we argue that response measures, response strategies like salvaging or sanitation logging cannot be efficient unless they are supported by strong preparedness and prevention phases. And just very shortly, this preparedness phase may, for example, include the deployment of these monitoring systems. It may include building up nursery capacities to have enough seedlings to regenerate the disturbed areas. It may include efficient game control to do not have everything planted after the outbreak eaten by ungulates. In prevention phase, you may, for example, reduce rotation land because older managed forests are more vulnerable. You can support diversity of your forest. You can do more intensive thinning operation to increase the individual vitality and resistance of individual trees. In response actions, you may, for example, reduce harvests to make free available resources, human resources, for emergency situations, and you may do well-organized salvage and sanitation logging. And the most important component here is this recovery phase, which Markus quite highlighted, that this is really a forward-looking phase, that here we want to use disturbances as opportunities to establish a new, better climate-adapted and better resilient forest that may work also under future climatic conditions and all these future risks which we are expecting in the future. And Markus,
so a lot of the material we presented today is summarized in some of the studies that we carried out under the lead of Thomas under the EFI. So we are very often trying to summarize the knowledge of scientists and then convey this message also to policymakers. So that's the background of this Living with Bark Beetles report from science to policy. And then in the last years, we had also under the pan-European policy process Forest Europe, we have now established this for risk facility, which start operating from January onwards at the EFI office in Bonn. But it was already tested in the last years under the last chairmanship of Forest Europe under the German residency. And in that we have explored like how can we gather best practices on managing wildfire, storm and bark beetles. How can we actually support across boundaries the sharing of experiences? Because a lot of these challenges, like just imagine the wildfire example that Thomas had shown in his one example, this was completely unexpected that such a big wildfire could affect an area in Central Europe. So we have to look at experiences from other regions where people have been exposed to these challenges and that they actually have developed good practices, and that we can actually share such good practices across boundaries. That's the objective of the Forest Risk Facility, and will now become an operational facility under the Forest Europe process. And with this, I think we can wrap up. And our key message for the end is hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And I think we can prepare also in Scotland a lot of things to be better prepared than what some of the regions that you've seen today were. Thank you very much. And I think with this, we end our presentation. And now it's I'm looking forward to hear to Max for the last intervention before the questions and answers.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. I'm hopefully this is working okay. Can you see my screen there, Thomas and Marcus?
Yes.
Perfect, brilliant. Thanks very much. Sorry, my camera's off. Zoom is not very happy with me this morning, so I'm gonna have to give this camera free. But Thomas, Marcus, thank you so much for your presentation and sort of setting the scene there and showing that the UK certainly isn't alone in facing this. But I think the scale of what's being dealt with in Europe is so much greater than anything that we've got over here, and it sort of shows the way things kind of could be going. And I think Thomas sort of mentioned very subtly there in part of his presentation, Czechia is moving away from spruce forestry because of Ips typographus largely, and because of the damage that they're causing with increased temperatures and windstorm events. And I think that's pretty important for us to understand that that's going on the continent. So I'm just going to sort of whip through some slides, hopefully, although it doesn't seem to be moving. Why is that? Why is my mouse? Sorry, let's try this again. There we go. So I'm just going to sort of whip through some of this, but again, Thomas has kind of introduced Ips typographus beautifully, but I think we need to kind of look at some of what makes the UK sort of unique here, really. And one of those is that obviously we grow primarily Sitka spruce rather than Norway spruce, although Norway spruce is certainly grown throughout all three countries, but also primarily sort of in the southeast of England, where we're getting these establishments of Ips typographus. Most of those plots of Norway spruce in the southeast, very few of them are what we sort of generally call forest quality. Most of them are shelter belts, ex-Christmas tree plantations, or plantations that were originally established in the 60s and 70s that have kind of been left to rack and ruin. But some of them are extremely good. They've been well managed, well thinned, well maintained, coming towards the end of their sort of productive lifespan anyway. But we're still seeing it establishing in those. So it is sort of going for everything really at the moment. Now, we've sort of long known that Ips typographus is going to be a serious risk to the UK's spruce industry. Some of these, and we'll look at some of the surveillance that's been going on there. But what's key is that there have been a number of major periods of interceptions of Ips typographus. So one of those was sort of in the 1990s, when an awful lot of timber got imported from the Baltic states. Generally very low quality. The number of interceptions that we had of Ips really increased significantly, but a lot of that timber was sort of eventually refused, and sort of improved communication and improved treatments meant that we actually had very few interceptions of live Ips typographus, and we've not knowingly found a live interception of Ips coming into the UK through this means since 2018. Although we can infer that they have done it as well, which we'll get onto in a bit. And then the other key period was after the Second World War. A lot of material was moved into the UK, and an awful lot of interceptions of Ips typographus took place. But as far as we knew, none of those led to any establishments. So it was a bit unusual when we found them in 2018 in November over in down in Kent, in the very furthest southeast of England. This was a relatively small woodland, but about 30 odd trees infested, but some of these were at very high densities. And it's not necessarily a surprise that, if anyone remembers 2018, it was an incredibly hot summer for the UK, extremely dry. And we began to see Ips typographus feeding on some of these live. They weren't necessarily healthy trees, they were extremely drought stressed. But they were feeding on standing trees as opposed to any snap material, any fallen material, things like that. But we couldn't work out how they'd got here. There was no wood processor, there was no major importer, nothing like that. But it was a woodland on a south-facing hill. So we put a huge amount of effort into surveying for Ips more widely. And failed to find anything in 2019 and 2020. And we are extremely confident that at that point in time, we had no breeding Ips here. The number of sites that were surveyed was enormous. We kept finding woodlands like this, which looked like they should have Ips. And one of the key things that sort of I can read by looking at this photograph is that there's a succession of material here in different states of sort of quality and decay for ribs, which is crucial. There's some fresh snap tops here. There's standing dead material. Some of it's a bit old, some of it's newer. But what IPS really needs is kind of areas where there's going to be fresh, recently dead material every single year to allow their populations to slowly build up. But even then, when we found woodlands like this, right in the southeast, we still didn't find anything. A lot of this was helped along by helicopter surveys. So helicopters can cover ground a lot more quickly than we can. And following up on any sort of dodgy material that was identified from the air, we can go in on the ground and then pick them up. But again, we just didn't find anything in 2019, 2020. So it was a little bit of a surprise when we began to pick up some new populations in 2021. And this has continued sort of year on year, really. But what we're not seeing is these really, really big establishments again. So that very first site still remains our worst site, really. But one of the key messages to get across as well is that we've not really seen IPS coming onto healthy trees. We've seen them on standing trees, but we've never seen them on genuinely healthy trees. There's always been some significant drought stress in particular. But the other thing, and just to go back to a point that was made earlier on, is that the policy and the contingency that we had for IPS typographus just didn't work initially. The eradication protocol that we had worked really well for one site, but it didn't scale when suddenly we're dealing with 13, 16, 24 outbreak sites every year. It was too labor intensive. We just didn't have the ability to deal with that. So what we also know is that because they're not going for healthy trees, we can make a number of adjustments here to reduce the costs to the landowners and allow them to make better cost recovery by being able to sell the healthy timber as opposed to having to chip it all. And just to kind of remind everyone that the response to IPS is a level 5 incident category. That's one down from COVID-19. So it is taken really quite seriously. One of the strange things that we have with IPS, and one of the weird paradoxes in their biology that we don't quite understand here, is that we really haven't seen much strong evidence for dispersal between sites in the UK. So even from the original sites and from other sites that we've found this year, we still haven't really found them effectively spreading. So one of our worst sites found this year, which is really in quite a shocking state, has quite a high density of IPS typographus. There's another woodland 800 meters away with spruce in a very similar condition and a single gallery, one gallery. 800 meters away, and otherwise it seems to us to be perfectly suitable. So we don't know why they're not really able to kind of to really move very far in the UK. Largely that's probably because if there's suitable material for them to feed on, they're not really going to move very far. They'll just stay within that central region until they build up enough to get moving. So we have been catching them quite really quite far. We've seen this data before. Some of the beetles caught in pheromone traps back in 2022. This was the original demarcated area here in red, where spruce movement is restricted. But what we've shown really since then is that effectively the beetles themselves are coming over from significant outbreaks in Belgium and France. And we suspected this back in 2019 when we started getting a lot of beetles coming into the traps, but failed to find any beetles coming into the trees. And we always say, one of our little mottos is always, beetles in traps don't necessarily mean beetles in trees, and that's absolutely true, because the vast majority of the sites that we go to, even here where we can see, there's some traps with some significant numbers of beetles in here, these won't necessarily be outbreak sites, and chances are very good that actually most of those aren't. But what we're looking at here is a dispersal distance way in far in advance of anything that was previously thought possible. But we don't really know how far they can get. So the previous sort of estimates for IPS are about sort of 45 kilometers. possibly a bit further for the American Dendroctonus species, which we won't talk about today, but we've kind of moved that on. So this is a nice graphic, which I'm hoping will play if I click it. Oh, it doesn't. There we go. Which is produced from some modeling using the named particle dispersal model, and this shows daily wind dispersal into Kent. So this is hindcasting, and what this is showing is effectively when some of those stronger colours there in that wind plume cross over Europe, that means that's a day when beetles could have come from Europe, and we can really see that there are a number of times that plume goes sort of right over southern Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, France. So yeah, dispersal from Europe is theoretically possible. Now, there's quite a lot of work to do on this, and we're really at the sort of very beginning of what this can show us for Ips typographus, and this is making a number of assumptions, but fundamentally 300 kilometers seems to be a common dispersal distance. Now, as I say, this is beetles in traps. This isn't necessarily beetles in trees, and we really don't know what this incredible dispersal does for the beetles. And my suspicion, based on what we've seen, is that they are actually quite bad at managing to establish themselves over this kind of distance, because the effect of long distance dispersal on their fecundity seems to be quite significant, but we don't really know how much this is going to affect things. So Thomas showed up some of our phenology models, which we'll go into a little bit more detail. But we've managed to refine those and sort of confirm that most of those phenology models work for the data that we've got for the UK. And then we're using this atmospheric dispersal model to look at hindcasting that source population. What we're going for now is beginning to try and show risk maps, which are going to be combining the effect of beetle flight, the direction, and contact with spruce woodland. So we can see here that this is kind of a prototype, as it were. But what we've got for a few of these is certain peaks when the flight distance meets a number of spruce boxes for Europe, effectively using some of the European data. And some of these peaks here correlate quite nicely with traps, with trap catches of Ips. But there's a lot more to do here. But that's exactly what we're trying to move towards. So there are three factors really that seem to affect Ips's ability to establish here. These are sort of entry and volcanism, how well they're going to be able to sort of grow and breed here. Do they ever encounter the spruce species that we're interested in? And are those trees in a susceptible, weakened state for Ips to get established? And then how much is climate change going to affect all of these things? And we've kind of managed to go through and slowly tick these things off. So we know that they're able to come into the UK. We know that they're not particularly good at dispersing here, but they can certainly have 2 generations a year quite easily through most of the south of England. And we know that they come into contact with the host. What we're trying to work on now is what the distribution of Norway spruce is, Norway spruce and Sitka spruce across the UK. We've got very good data for the public forest estate, but actually the private data here is relatively poor, especially where these are, say, some of those ex-Christmas tree plantations. So we're looking now at trying to predict where that spruce is going to be, and then ground truth to confirm some of those predictions based on satellite data. And then hopefully we can go a bit further and look at some of those susceptible trees and using that SPEI index that Thomas mentioned to investigate drought. Now, climate change, we know, is only going to make things sort of worse for us, really, and certainly better for Ips typographus. But has this stopped Ips establishing in the past? So these are some sort of forecasts here. So I won't go too much into the detail of Ips's biology, but effectively red means more generations. That's worse for us. And these are just a few predictions from the next 10 or 15 years or so. And effectively, yes, the future looks worse for Ips typographus, really, and particularly in the more northern spruce growing areas, it's only going to get worse. But we're not expected to have 3 generations a year, or even 4 as the Czech Republic is, since largely because of our very mild climate. One thing I should say is that it's not our cold winters that affects IPS establishment, or indeed insect establishment here. We don't have cold winters. We have very, very mild winters, which no one quite believes. But IPS typographus is quite happy in Norway, Finland, and Sweden, where it goes down to sort of -30. We certainly don't have that, but we do have a very cold summers, and that will significantly impact IPS. But as we can see, climate change is really going to knock those out. But those interceptions in the late 40s, we mentioned previously, it has been assumed that perhaps the climate was somewhat cooler back then, and therefore IPS might not have established there. But actually, we've managed to go back and dig out some of the climate data and hindcast that, and actually no, the climate there doesn't seem to have been significantly different enough from the modern climate to have potentially stopped IPS establishing. And actually, through most of those areas, just like today, it could have had 2 generations without too many issues. And so I think it's unlikely that the climate has changed significantly enough since the 1940s to have now allowed IPS to establish. So it doesn't seem to be climate that's stopped IPS coming in before. But something has stopped IPS. And working on what that is really crucial. So we've sort of mentioned previously that our UK forest cover is very low, very, very patchy. This is a sort of a graph from our paper looking at managing IPS typographus, which went out earlier on this year. We can see the area of spruce here is very small compared to the wider woodland, and that's very much where we get these sort of larger catches of beetles here. But one of our key questions really is looking at Sitka spruce, which is obviously our main conifer spruce. Our main forestry spruce. And how susceptible that is versus Norway is a really key question. And at the moment, we know that IPS typographus will certainly feed on Sitka, and it will certainly have outbreaks on Sitka. And some colleagues have been doing some great work over in Denmark, looking at some of the outbreaks of IPS typographus there on Sitka spruce. But what sort of if there are differences in the susceptibility, we don't quite know yet, but we suspect that there might be. But as well as that, of course, Sitka is grown in somewhat cooler, wetter environments, and that's going to impact IPS as well. And we know certainly in the UK that they seem to get very badly hit by entomopathogenic fungi, which are here as part of the natural environment as well. Those wetter areas, wetter, milder areas are going to have a lot more of those fungi around, which may well impact IPS a lot more than we think at the moment. So certainly there's a lot more to do there looking at Sitka spruce versus Norway. But the key message that we try and get over to people is that we never thought that IPS typographus was capable of naturally dispersing into the UK. So we do have a contingency plan for IPS, which was written in 2015, and nowhere in that does it mention natural dispersal. It just assumed that populations had possibly been moved over in timber, which is still a risk, and it's certainly a risk that we are very aware of. But the key is that it probably has established in the UK, but it's probably died out before it was actually found. Now, remember that all of this work on dispersal has only been the last couple of years. I don't think there's any reason why IPS won't have been coming over into the UK before that. And bearing in mind that although some of these outbreaks in Europe have only really been going on since sort of 2018, possibly a little bit earlier, we found this first population in Kent in 2018, but it will have established a few years before that. So it probably had got over here before we'd really started this sort of big outbreak that had popped up in 2018. So just very briefly to sort of go through some of the work that we're doing behind the scenes, which there really isn't very much time to get into. But our key questions at the moment for IPS are that how do they orientate themselves in the landscape? We know if they're able to fly over, we know that they're making some sort of decision when they're up in the atmosphere about when to land, but what decisions are they making and how are they doing that? Will remote sensing ever actually beat the helicopters and the ground truthing? I really don't think so. I think I was given a statistic that about 50% of the spruce in England is flown with helicopters every single year. So therefore, every block of spruce is surveyed every 2 years, effectively, within England, and then ground truthed by some of our brilliant surveyors there who are very, very good at looking for rips. But will remote sensing ever beat that? I don't think so, but we shall see. What's the most effective way to actually eradicate them? Where are the areas that are at risk, and how much is drought going to impact that? How badly might Sitka be affected? And then probably my favorite bit is looking at the moment at trying to develop remote traps, which are sort of modified versions of this trap, where we can get in-trap image recognition, so we can have a look at sort of real-time sampling of Ips typographus, and we can end up having that data very, very quickly, rather than at the moment where there's a number of delays between Ips coming into traps, that sample being collected, sample being identified, and then that data uploaded to sort of our central portal. We might be able to do this remotely and end up with data that's much, much faster than we've got at the moment. But I think the key bit as well is, well, what's next? What else have we underestimated? So we've massively underestimated Ips typographus. There's a number of other Ips species in Europe, and one of the ones that I'm very concerned about at the moment is Ips amitinus, which is moving sort of northwest through Europe. Ips amitinus feeds both on pine and spruce. What are we going to be able to do about Ips amitinus if it ever gets here? Can we even do anything? So just a little sort of note about some of our engagement. Previously, we were very it was quite closed off, the engagement that we were doing, but that's begun to get a lot more open now, much more proactive, which is brilliant. And even some of these more controversial plans. So spruce planting has been banned in the southeast of England, largely, which has actually been accepted generally pretty positive, even though occasionally we do see some interesting mistakes made. So this is the front page of one of our bigger newspapers, the Daily Star, and it's rare that we ever actually make anything quite this significant, even though they got it wrong, because Christmas tree growers are quite clearly exempt from the ban on spruce. But they did put a Christmas tree hat on top of an Ips, which made my day, really. So yeah, it's good to see that we're going the right way. So just to talk about resilience very, very briefly, don't forget our forestry system is very unusual. So we've only got 3 native conifer species. Only one, Scots pine, is obviously a significant forestry conifer here. And so we don't have the native guilds of bark beetles, other beetles involved in the decay of wood, their various specialist parasitoids and predators, things like that they have in Europe on these species, because they aren't native. So all of our spruce feeding species would have had to really establish, especially after 1800, when we began to grow more significant areas of both species of spruce. So we need to accept that there's an ecological gap here, and one of the reasons that spruce grows so well is because the bark beetle fauna on spruces is pretty small. We don't have many of the species that they have in Europe, although we do find new bark beetle species here every couple of years. So any European conifer group which has got so any conifer group which has got European relatives, so larches, abies, silver firs, and spruce, is at a higher risk of some of these bark beetles moving across than things like Douglas fir or hemlock, where actually there are plenty of bark beetles in their native range in America, but there aren't really any over here. So there's a real ecological gap here for species to get established, and we need to accept that as those species move into the UK somehow, that suddenly they're going to be impacted. And previously, if we had if we had trees affected by drought, if there are bark beetles there that are able to start jumping on those weakened trees and killing them, that's going to significantly impact how well these tree species are going to do here long term as other bark beetles move in. But of course, if an American species on something like Douglas fir does establish, it's going to have no competition and very few parasitoids. So we find that some of our bark beetles are doing very different things in the UK as opposed to Europe. And now's not the time to sort of go into that, but the niches and the behavior that they have is very different. And we need to accept that there's going to be changes here because we're working in effectively a non-native ecosystem, which is in quite a bit of flux. And the key really here is looking at diversity at all levels. So a diversity of different tree species, different ages, rather than looking at these sort of big monocultures as we know. So just finally, just to sort of whip through some of the lessons that we've learned. We know that the UK isn't as isolated as we ever thought it was. Its dispersal has been massively underestimated, but we really don't know what kind of drives that and where the triggers are and what helps them get established here. So we know we can eradicate hips very successfully, and I should say, despite those very large numbers of establishments that we have here, all of those are subject to eradication procedures, and all of our evidence to date shows that those all work. And hopefully later on this year, we'll be in a position where we can declare that those first sites from 2021 will have been eradicated, which is really good. So we've actually got very, very good at eradicating these little populations of it, but we don't know what's going to happen if they're able to get into larger areas. And last year's interception in Scotland really showed that we needed to rethink some of those areas because the contingency plan that we had was not going to work. It was not possible. And actually, we need to be a lot more thorough about scenario testing some of our new plans before they actually get accepted and taken forward. So just a colossal thanks to a huge number of people who've been involved in all of this work. Although I'm presenting, there's a vast range of entomologists and folk in policy who've supported a lot of this work, and they really do have my immense thanks. And that is where I will stop sharing. And I'm hoping we've got a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you, Max. I think we're going to be pushed very much for questions now. We have 3 minutes left on the call. I'll see, Flora, is there any one particular question that seems to be coming up that we could just squeeze in? I noticed there was one on contingency planning, and I'll just answer that very, very quickly and say that the UK contingency plan is currently being reviewed in total, along with the action plans about how we actually deal with any findings in the different countries as well. But the overall contingency plan is currently under a rewrite, as Max sort of hinted. It's slightly out of date, the one we had, and we are redoing that at this time. So Flora, is there one particular question we could sort of aim at the panel, do you think, that's of main interest?
So I think the panel have been going through and answering the questions. Thank you very much, Thomas and Marcus, for doing that. And I think everybody's questions have been answered. So I hope we have a way to share that with the people who are watching this recording back. I think the one question that maybe stood out that hadn't been answered was about measures put in place to reduce cross-border invasion within Europe. Is what's sort of ongoing between the countries to try and stop the spread? I don't know if Thomas or Marcus would prefer to answer that question.
I think Max's presentation was giving a very good example that this is not really something that you can prevent, because if there is airflow like was then bringing the bark beetles to UK, then that's what you are living with. And in the border areas, there's no way you can stop the natural population dynamics across borders. There's really no way that you could try to fight the bark beetle between Belgium and Germany, for example. No way. I think we have to just accept that such political borders don't play any role in controlling the spread of bark beetles.
Maybe one comment here. that the situation in continental Europe is perhaps a bit different than in UK. Here, bark beetle is simply native to these forests, and these endemic populations simply exist everywhere. They simply are there, and they are waiting for chance to outbreak. So it's not like some country doesn't have a bark beetle, but it can cross the border and reach the country. Basically, where is Norway spruce, there is bark beetle, and it is waiting to outbreak. One specific situation which we maybe encountered in Czechia, that salvaged wood where we still had living beetles alive was transported across the Czechia, and in some parking places of these big tracks, beetles could have been leaving the tracks and infest the surrounding forest. But it's really hard to say if this is a rumor or if it can really be the true. But these stop the spread strategies and eradication things more concern like real invasive species like ambrosia beetle and things like this, which require such quarantine measures in continent.
I'm going to step in now and say we have reached 12 o'clock. So unfortunately, we haven't got time for more questions, but thank you so much for everyone for listening today, and especially to our speakers, Thomas, Marcus and Max. I mean, that was absolutely fantastic. Some great stuff in there. And I think while there were some very sobering thoughts, I think we are in a lucky position. And I think Thomas hit on it very much there. One of the things that struck me was we are lucky we don't have an endemic population of Ipsifographus in this country. And I think part of our resilience measures are ensuring that we keep it that way and we don't get an endemic population. So we then can't get that explosion and that effect. There are lots of other measures mentioned in there about how we can get our risk plans in place and the importance of prevention over response. And I think that's an important thing. We've got chance. Having said that, having seen how the impact suddenly flared up in Central Europe, and the impact was much greater than that which was anticipated, I think we need to start acting. And I think it's important we do start acting now and consider the lessons that have learned. And it's interesting to see how you're looking in Central Europe at the species mix, making sure you plant in the appropriate places and the appropriate species in the right part of the forest where the conditions are best suited for it. And I think that there are lessons we need to take forward as our rotations change, and also in looking at how we manage our forest following wind blow, etc. So we're not creating an environment that is suitable for the beetles to explode if we did get an endemic population anywhere that we're unaware of. So increase our surveillance and improve our management techniques would be the key messages I take out of that. Sorry for overrunning very slightly to everyone. And thank you again to our speakers. As I say, the presentations and the recording of this will be on the Scottish Forestry website afterwards. And thank you very much to the ICF and Joe for hosting us today. Thank you all.